Okay, African Americans in the war. There was going to be another sort of great migration of African Americans moving from the South up to the North for industrial jobs, again, contributing some racial tension in the United States during World War II. But what we're starting to see is that with the Black Cabinet of the New Deal era, you're going to see African American leaders demand of FDR that there be an end to racial discrimination and hiring of wartime jobs, which are going to become increasingly important over time. And with the threats of going on strike and protests from people like Randolph, that labor union leader, FDR does agree to create something called the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which was committed to stopping racial discrimination on employment for federal wartime jobs. This is a big deal for the African American community. It's the first example of government trying to regulate racial discrimination in employment and hiring. Another thing that is important for the African community is the establishment of a group called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. And this is really one of the first sort of modern civil rights organizations for African Americans, protesting mistreatment and Jim Crow segregation in the United States, conducting some sit-ins during the war. They're not widespread, but they do exist, and they're pushing this question that how could you have the United States claim to be, the symbol of liberty and freedom and the good guy, right, in a war against, evil, right, Nazis and their allies, promoting justice and liberty for everyone around the world when you have groups of Americans, right, here that are really not treated equally or fairly, right, who are clearly discriminated against. And so when you think of the civil rights movement of Dr. Martin Luther King and other, figures of the 20th century, you have to remember that one of the predecessors is CORE, right, of the 1940s, a civil rights organization. African Americans did see combat. That doesn't mean that they were not discriminated against within the U.S. military. They were. But there are clear examples of valor and heroism. On this image here, you can see a very important figure at Pearl Harbor. So his name was Dory Miller. He was an American sailor who, in the Navy, black sailors were only relegated to mechanics and cooks. So he wasn't trained for combat operations. But when the attack was happening on his battleship, he ran up and with no training was able to shoot down several Japanese pilots with a gun, essentially, on deck, and thus was awarded a Navy Cross for his valor. Another thing that ends up happening is that African Americans want to see more combat, and you have something called the Tuskegee Airmen. So the U.S. Army considers an experiment in which the Tuskegee Institute, from Booker T. Washington's school he founded, could train black airmen, pilots essentially. And the training was so intense and the bar was held so high that when the Tuskegee Airmen were actually used in the war, they were incredibly successful. In fact, their stats were often better than their white counterparts. And so there's missions in Europe in which bomber crews specifically requested Tuskegee pilots because of how good they actually were. Native Americans. Did you see combat? They serve in different functions, but one of the most interesting ways is in the Pacific, there's this effort to keep American coded transmission secret from the Japanese who are trying to break our codes like we broke theirs. And we use the Navajo, right? They become known as, wind talkers or code talkers to our advantage. The Japanese, spying in really had no dictionary or written component to help correlate what they were hearing and breaking it down because it was such an insular community and really just an oral tradition. So that was another example of minorities in the war. Here are some cool photos and pictures. This is a very interesting photo of two African Americans serving an artillery unit with some, jokes for Adolf Hitler in Europe. And this is the symbol of a black combat unit in Patton's army in Europe called the Black Panthers, or nicknamed that. And they saw some service on the Western Front. Later, the name will be used by a militant civil rights organization, which we'll talk about later. And here's a photograph of the Tuskegee Airmen, some of them anyway, again, serving with great valor and distinction in Europe. Women and children at war. One big thing the United States has to deal with during the war is how do we ramp up production if millions of men are leaving the workforce, right, to go serve in the military? And there's a number of politicians who don't want to accept the answer that they end up having to accept, and that you're going to have to kind of leave the sort of traditional gender norms to the side, right, and actually encourage women to enter the workforce. And women answer the call. And it's not simply white collar jobs. There are still women doing that, obviously. There's still some women serving as nurses and other roles for the military. But we do see a huge surge, really for the first time, of women in blue collar professions, working at factories, grinding, welding, riveting, machining, as you can see in this photograph. This is a young woman machining parts in a factory in Fort Worth. And the government actually ends up promoting this because of how important this contribution is to the war effort itself. And it develops into a propaganda symbol, right? Rosie the Riveter here at home during the war. And this is really tough. You know, you have women who have to physically kind of adapt to this new setting, working long hours, sometimes 6 days a week, right? Doing hard labor. And this applies to women sometimes who are, you know, devoid of any childcare, right? And they still make it work. So again, there's a huge commitment for millions of Americans to the war effort. Here's some images of Rosie the Riveter. The one on the left, obviously, is the one that we're typically familiar with. This is the sort of government-sanctioned image of Rosie the Riveter. The one on the right is actually the original image by Norman Rockwell, a famous painter from the Saturday Evening Post. For the government and for most mainstream, maybe a bit too masculine in her features, and so they softened her up a bit. But again, demonstrating the female commitment to helping win the war. The baby boom on the last slide refers to the huge surge of population. Basically, people getting married and starting to have kids, and that actually starts during World War II. And a lot of what we've been talking about is way back in the past. But try to put yourself in their shoes. You're 18, or you're going to be 18, right, in a year, ready to graduate and go to college. Imagine if you're ready to graduate high school and you're expecting to have a member of your family or someone you're seeing or yourself, right, go into the military. And World War II really is a very dangerous war. There's a lot of men who are not coming back home, because of the scale of the fighting, the intensity and all that. And so a lot of teenagers are making the decision to get married and start having kids now, even if the husband or father may not return. And once the war is over, the GIs who actually do end up returning not only want to get educated and get a job, but a lot of them also want to start a family. And this ties into kind of why are we fighting the war? Now, for the government, it's to promote the four freedoms, right, and protect rights around the world and destroy Nazi tyranny and all these sort of big ideas. But for the average soldier and the average, spouse or family member, it can sometimes be boiled down to something more simple. For most Americans, it is economic prosperity. That this is the same generation that had lived, right, through a decade of the Depression and the Dust Bowl, right? And now that this new great crisis dominated so much of them, they felt that it was actually bringing prosperity back to the United States and hopefully going to maintain that, right, after the war. So that alone was worth it. And that helped motivate soldiers, sometimes thousands of miles away from home in really hellish conditions. Here's a direct quote from a Marine on Guadalcanal. "Home is where the good things are, the generosity, the good pay, the comforts, the democracy, the pie," right? And again, there's a sense that, I may be suffering right now. I may be losing friends. I may have gotten hurt in the war. But, my girlfriend, my parents, my siblings, they're doing good. They're back to work, right? They're going to drive-ins. The restaurants are open again. And that's worth it. I'm fighting for them. I would encourage you guys to watch this speech from FDR linked on the slide. An example of trying to promote prosperity, right, the sense of the importance of it for soldiers was the development of the USO, the United Service Organizations, which really grew a lot in World War II. And this was meant to kind of, extend that prosperity to our soldiers overseas and some of the soldiers, training and getting deployed here at home. So for the guys overseas, they would encourage celebrities to go visit them, right? Famous actresses, comedians, entertainers, things like that. And here in the United States, they would encourage social functions, right? Dances, community gatherings, and that sort of thing, which further facilitated, in some respects, the baby boom, right? Where a lot of these teenagers were meeting for the first time, starting their dating and courtship, right? And eventually marrying. Here's the images that really catapulted that speech by FDR, The Four Freedoms. This is again by Norman Rockwell. And these are very powerful paintings because at this moment in time, they really capture the core essence of how Americans experience our liberties, right, that we value so highly in real life, right? On the left, you can see a man who's brave enough to get up and speak in front of his community. He doesn't have to fear repercussions for doing that. On the right, this is freedom from want, or basically prosperity. That as Americans, we expect to have family together and enjoy a peaceful, bountiful Thanksgiving, right, every year. It's a very American experience. On the left, you see now the image of Rockwell, freedom of worship, right, of religion. You can see, you know, different denominations, right, minority groups and so on together, all worshiping God in their own way, obviously being violated, right, by the Holocaust and other, persecution. And this last image on the right here is freedom from fear. And I think Rockwell was trying to capture a very personal moment that a lot of us, experience that we can tend to take for granted. That even during the war, Americans could be very confident putting their kids to bed at night, knowing that they'd be safe from any harm, right, come morning. That's not the case, right, for the millions of civilians around the world during the war that, have secret police breaking in doors and dragging parents away, or bombs, right, falling on the homes. And so this is something to be grateful for, but it's also something to fight for, right, to try to get other people around the world to enjoy those same sort of core, liberties and freedoms that we take sometimes for granted. Speaking of freedoms, World War II is not a war that sees, widespread violation of personal freedoms and individual liberty like World War I did under Wilson. That doesn't mean that there wasn't examples of that, though. So German and Italian Americans, they're not discriminated against. In fact, Italian Americans are the single greatest ethnicity, right, serving in the military during World War II. But the one group that does face intense discrimination and real egregious violation of their civil liberties are Japanese Americans. In the United States, most Japanese Americans are located on the West Coast. Within their community, there's two terms used, Issei and Nisei. Issei are Japanese immigrants. These are typically the grandparents or parents. That was about a third of the Japanese American population. Nisei are Japanese Americans, right? Either the kids who were first generation born here or those that immigrated and were naturalized, right, that became American citizens. And that was about 2/3, right, of the community. But after the attacks of Pearl Harbor, there's no effort to sort of distinguish between them or evaluate the community based on those, terms. They're facing intense prejudice and hatred, especially on the West Coast. And by 1942, the U.S. military and FDR have basically forced them under executive order to report to relocation centers. The government will refer to these as internment camps. Critics then and now call these concentration camps. The big difference, though, is that the U.S. government is not torturing them, not forcing them to conduct slave labor, and definitely not trying to exterminate them. So there is a difference, but it is a very shameful moment in which it comes to a head in the Korematsu decision in 1944. The Supreme Court has to rule whether or not this was a constitutional act, right, to remove people from their homes and businesses, essentially stripping them of their property without any sort of due process or anything like that. And shockingly enough, the court in Korematsu upholds Japanese internment. They claimed that the crisis was so severe that the president of the military had every right to do this, and there was evidence, quote unquote, of questionable loyalty within this community. This is such an egregious decision that has never been overturned, by the way, that the U.S. government by the 90s will apologize for Japanese internment and actually pay out reparations. So we see this as one of the most shameful episodes that occurred to American citizens during the war. You can see here a clear example, right, of the discrimination. This is the actual reporting for government relocation that was posted up in California. And this is another example of a Japanese internment camp. Very tough conditions. These are temporary soldier barracks guarded with guard towers, often located in very rural areas, right, in the mountains in California, Colorado, and the deserts of New Mexico. And a lot of Japanese Americans, despite those really tough conditions and this clear mistreatment, try to make the best of it and put on a good face and try to prove to the government that they're good Americans and support the country during this period. We'll talk more about that in the next one.